1/3 of all murder cases in America remain open.
He had told me that if I opened my eyes, he would slit my throat.
Each one is called a cold case.
The DNA evidence taken from the victim was a match. The Linden rapist was at it again.
Based on the hit A&E television program.
A phone call is placed, one that changes a family's life forever.
Cold Case Files, the podcast.
You could see the fire in his eyes. He screamed at me, "You want it? Get your tape recorder out."
Get new episodes of Cold Case Files every Tuesday on Podcast One, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and anywhere you listen to podcasts.
I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the prosecutors. Today on the prosecutors, tap, tap, tap. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, by my patriotic co-host, Alice.
Hi, Brett. We are recording the day after the birthday of America, Independence Day, so I think that is very fitting. Happy July 5th, Brett.
July 5th? Hey, it's fun, you know? It's one of those, week-long celebrations. My daughter celebrates her birthday, every couple weeks, so America can do it for one extra day. And in fact, we're recording this late because we were going to record it last week, and then there were early fireworks, and we had to cancel. So I think it's appropriate.
You know what? I don't... There probably were fireworks on July 4th around my house, but every, thing around me, fireworks were before July 4th. So I don't know why that was. It did thunder pretty badly yesterday, and it's thundering right now as well. But, we're still here, and fireworks are not.
Yeah, July 4th was about the only day I did not go to see fireworks. We went to see fireworks on multiple days, but not on July 4th. So, and I regret nothing.
I thought I was gonna see you at the pool. You guys didn't make it, or did you
we didn't
go
make
later?
It. We decided to take just a nice, relaxing July 4th. So,
but relaxing is with your kids at home, because my kids at home tear up our house.
No, they just run around in circles. It's fine. If you just let them destroy things, they're happy. You're happy. It's just you have to be willing to accept some level of destruction. So, but yeah, we had a good time. It was a great 4th of July. Really enjoyed the fireworks. And Alice, do we have fireworks today? Fireworks.
Boy.
While we talk about the Adnan Syed case as we continue this, and we're getting to one of the more controversial things about this case. And it's funny. These big cases, I feel like on Twitter, they always have weird things that people on Twitter say that the only people who really understand it are the people who are in the group. So the Avery case, they like to say TikTok. So if you ever notice the Twitter people who are doing Making a Murderer, they'll be TikTok on their Twitter, and it's what does that mean? But for them, apparently it means something I don't know, the time is coming where the truth's going to be revealed. I'm not sure. But with Adnan's case, it's tap, tap, tap. And you'll say something to them about the case, and they're tap, tap, tap. And it's what does that mean? And I didn't know what it meant until I listened to Undisclosed and watched the documentary, and someone finally explained it to me. Because at first I was so are you trying to say that the police somehow used Morse code with Jay? I'm a little confused about what's happening, but I now understand it and am prepared to discuss it. For those of you who don't know, if you listen to cleaned up versions of Jay's interviews, some people will tell you that you will hear a tapping sound that indicates that the police are adjusting Jay's statement sort of on the fly. We talked about this statement last week, the March 15th statement, the second statement that Jay gave. You may recall there are some things that are different between the first statement and the second statement, particularly the times shift. And what has been said, I think, by some folks about this is that what's happening is the police are creating the timeline. They have the cell phone records in front of them, And basically, as Jay's telling his story, if he misses something or if he gets it slightly wrong, you hear the tapping on the table. And that's a police officer tapping on the records, which they've already gone through in the time before they started the recording, saying, don't forget, Jay, this is the time you're supposed to talk about this. And occasionally, Jay will say things that kind of make you think that's true. He'll be like, oh, yeah. And then he'll talk about something else that happened. And the question is this the police creating this story so that they can convict Adnan? I don't know if you have any thoughts. I'm happy to just continue talking about it.
No, I was trying to think if we wanted to talk more about the tapping before I dove into it, but if only, just from personal experience, we'll get into this actual interview and what you hear or don't hear and whether there's tap, tap, tap. But just as one lawyer to another, Brett, boy, do I wish I could be so good as the alleged, coaching that is happening here as to be able to control my witnesses that I've been able to coach with taps. And I say that in complete honesty, right? We prep our witnesses for trial or for hearings ad nauseum. I mean, our biggest witnesses we can spend weeks on end with. And it's not coaching, but you get to know each other very well. They know what kinds of questions you're going into. You're on the same, team if you are directing them, because if you're cross-examining them, you're unlikely to get any prep time with them. And I can't tell you how wild it is to have a witness on the stand during trial, because people get nervous, people just start talking, cross-examination happens. And I have slammed my hand on the podium before to be like, just stop talking without saying those words. And I can't control them. They'll be like, oh, you must want me to keep talking. I'm going to talk more. And it's going to be really incriminating. And it's going to be the opposite of what I really mean to say. But I'm going to keep talking. And it is infuriating how difficult it is for me to use ESP with my witnesses on the stand. And that's just my experience. Maybe I'm a really bad coacher, but anyone who's ever directed witnesses and had a situation where you had to communicate with a witness without words, it's very, very difficult. And I say all that to say the police could have coached him and they could be redirecting him. But I want you to know that having all lawyers do this with their witnesses in the sense of you want them to go a certain route. That's why you have an outline. That's why you prep them. And it is so difficult to guide your witness where you want them to go to. And even harder if you're trying to use nonverbal cues or do something that is underhanded, because everything overhand, over the podium, I'm like, no, don't talk about it. And they still don't get it. And the number of times a witness will get off the stand and say to me, oh, was that what you were trying to get at? I did not understand you doing that is like all the time. And that's because communication is difficult and trying to guide someone is difficult. Again, I'm talking about my experience to shed light on how difficult it is generally if the police is trying to guide a witness to say something the police want them to say and not the witness.
And two things I want to point out about this. Number one, definitely getting ahead of ourselves. But number two, Alice has multiple times talked about testimony, because testimony is where you want to make sure that your witness is saying exactly what you want them to say, because you want everything to line up, because that's when the jury's listening. And we're not even talking about that. We are talking about an interview with the police that, according to some people, has been manipulated. An interview that would have occurred a year, 9 months, a year before the actual trial, where they would have had the testimony about this. And the other thing that Alice is talking about is something that we're about to get into. The simple fact that talking a witness through their statement using evidence is not unusual. It's not unusual. It's not nefarious. It's not unethical. It, in fact, is exactly what you do. But before we get into all that, because we can talk more about that here in a second, there are a few things about this. If you've heard this, if you've listened to it, there are times where it seems like this is a possibility, where, like I said, there's tapping that seems to be connected to Jay sort of adjusting his story. But there's also a few other things going on here. Number one, this could just be an example of audio pareidolia. We've talked about pareidolia before, where you make order out of chaos, where you take random noise and you hear things that aren't random. It could totally be that. It could be that this tape has been used and reused The audio wasn't great, particularly in the original, and the taps are actually a result of enhancing this audio so you can hear it better. Any of you who've ever done any work in audio know that when you take poor audio and you try and clean it up, one of the problems is you are often introducing artifacts into the audio that makes it not great. The other thing that it could be is just random tapping. Could just be people tapping on the table. Or it could be that the police actually are using the documentation they have that list out cell phones, cell phone calls, cell phone times, and cell phone locations to adjust Jay's story. And here's the thing. Whether it was tapping or pointing or winking or whatever, we absolutely know that the police did this. And we know that because they testified to it at trial. So let's go through some of the testimony in this case. The Detective McGillivray, who was one of the detectives in this case, testified at trial. And during that testimony, here is the direct examination of him. Now, did you have occasion on or about March 15th or so to speak to Mr. Wilds again? Yes. Between the first conversation on the 28th and the one in March, what occurred? Then there's an objection. It's sustained. So they sort of like have to ask a new question. What happened that made you want to speak to Mr. Wilds again? You're going to be shocked at what he says. I had obtained cell site information as a result of the cell phone information that I wanted to talk to Mr. Wilds a second time. Shocker of shockers. The police now have evidence and they want to talk to Jay Wilds again to compare his statement to the evidence. And did you speak to him a second time? Yes, I did. As a result of the information that you obtained from that, what, if anything, did you do? He actually took us on a ride, and the cell site information that we had didn't correspond to his statement at first, at which time we narrowed the time frames down. He started to recall things a little better and took a second statement. Based on the second statement, what, if anything, did you do? We obtained a warrant for Adnan Syed, charging him with first-degree murder. I believe that was after the first one, correct. Drawing your attention to the second one, what, if anything, did you talk to after that as a result of the conversation that you had with Mr. Wilds? Okay, we also identified other persons from the cell phone records, one of them being Christy Vinson, who we've talked about before. And just to summarize, what piece of evidence was it that led you to Jen Pusateri, Jay Wilds, the victim's car, and Christy Vinson? Cell phone and cell phone records. Of who? Adnan Syed. So that's on direct. So on direct, you have the prosecution getting into the fact that during this second interview, the police now have these cell phone records, and they are confronting Jay with the records to correct, expose, whatever you want to call it, the inconsistencies in his statement. But it doesn't stop there. On cross-examination, you have Christina Gutierrez, who digs into this more. And she says, and then on the 13th, had you come to any conclusion about Mr. Wilds that his memory got better the more you spoke to him in regards to his recollection of events that occurred on January 13th? And he says, when we had the cell phone site locations, we told him we had cell site locations. The meat of the subject was the same. However, some of the phone calls that were made involved purchase of marijuana, and he originally didn't want to say anything about the marijuana because he thought he would get in trouble and get the people he was trying to buy the marijuana from in trouble. She goes on. So the answer to the question I asked you, Detective McGillivray, is yes. Yes, you had formed an opinion that his memory got better because the information you provided him, right? Yes. And his explanation for giving a different answer was he didn't want you to know about his marijuana buying on January 13th, the defendant and his marijuana purchases.
I mean, we are reading directly from the trial transcript, and this absolutely happens all the time. Think about it outside of the trial context in your own life when you're like, I cannot remember what I ate yesterday. But what if someone were to show you the menu of the restaurant that you went to? And you were like, oh, yeah, now that I have the menu in front of me and I went to, this deli, I absolutely got, the Reuben, and it was delicious. And things like that happen all the time, especially when you're talking to witnesses. In the first interview, Jay is giving the police leads, and they follow up on those investigative leads as they should, right? They now know more information, and they're going to follow those leads, and they could lead to dead ends. That happens sometimes where you go subpoena records, and it either backs up what the witness has said or doesn't back it up. And if it doesn't back it up, obviously you want to reconcile the conflicting information. And so you talk to the witness again and say, hey, last time you said this happened, but now we have these records that are set in stone, in this case, subpoena records from the cell phone company. Explain the difference to us. And sometimes it's because you're catching someone in a lie. Other times it's because it really does refresh their recollection, right? You've heard that term before. Have you refreshed your recollection? And that's because it's completely commonplace in court to have a witness not be able to remember things that may have happened weeks, months, years ago, and be able to look at some document that helps them refresh their recollection. Now, no, he's not looking at like a diary entry, unless he wrote down everything, which you could use a diary as refreshing your recollection. But it's not like he's reading off a script of what he did that day. Rather, he's getting independent information that means nothing to the police, right? These phone records, without Jay kind of extrapolating, this phone call was to a marijuana dealer. This phone call was to so-and-so. This was when we were doing this. I was nervous at this time. Without him kind of adding on his commentary to those records, they don't really mean that much. And we see this all the time. It's not nefarious. It is good investigative work, and it's also good cross-examination and good directing of your witness with records that they can't move from, because it helps direct them, because we all know our memories are faulty. We're imprecise. We're imprecise with our times. We're imprecise with our words. We're imprecise with our memories. That's just how our brains work. We are not robots. We don't, read back things verbatim whenever we tell about a past experience. We are kind of projecting on an impression of a memory of what's happened. And that's why kind of having these set in stone cell phone records are helpful in this case. And so part of going through the trial transcript is to show you that all of this kind of conspiracy theory was absolutely explored at trial. And it didn't stop there either, because on redirect, the state goes into it even more, attempting to recast what the defense attorney has suggested was coaching as using the new records to corroborate Jay's general timeline. So, the prosecution asked, and after that, but prior to the second conversation with Jay Wiles, what specific information did you have to subpoena again from the AT&T wireless company? Well, we had to send the subpoena along with a court order in order to get the cell site information that coincides with each of the numbers. Question, and is that column in State's Exhibit 34C? It is. And evaluating the first statement of Jay Wiles and going back for the second time, was that new information important as to why you went back to talk to him? Answer, it most certainly was. Then the prosecution asked, and would it be fair to say that it was important for you to see if this independent evidence could corroborate important parts of his statement? And he answered, yes. The prosecution then asked, and after you got the second statement and you began comparing it back to the cell site information that you received based on telephone calls made or received by the defendant's cell phone, did you in fact see a pattern of corroboration then between the cell phone information and Jay Wiles' statement? Yes. And actually, completely predictably, Ms. Gutierrez, Adnan's attorney, objected to this line of questioning because it's cutting against what she was trying to establish at cross-examination, and the court overruled it and in fact directed the witness to answer. So you see between the direct, the cross-examination, and the redirect, they are exploring both sides of the theory of, are you just using this evidence and doing follow-up investigation and then corroborating the witness testimony of Jay Wiles, and that's why you went back to him a second time, and letting the defense explore the, you're being coached and you're putting words in his mouth. So this is something that was completely out in the open. It is not secret. The jury heard all of this and was able to weigh it for themselves. And this doesn't even stop there. So you don't often see this, but there was a recross. So the defense steps back up again after the redirect and says, on the 15th, when you interviewed Jay Wiles, as you've already testified, he told you different information than he told you on the 28th, did he not? And he answered, somewhat, yes. Then the defense asked, and the only reason was not the cell site information, was it? There were several variables that affected the second interview. The defense asked, including the inconsistencies about what he had already told you. And he answered, the additional information that we had gotten. So it's probably not surprising by now that on cross-examination, Christina Gutierrez also asked Jay about the police using the phone records in the March 15th meeting. So it continues. The defense asked, okay, and you would agree that leaving out Patrick Furlow as someone you were trying to reach and get in contact with throughout the 13th of January was a lie by omission, would you not? And he responded, yes, ma'am. Question, but in fact, you did, correct? And he said, yes, ma'am. But you only mentioned Patrick Furlow once you were asked about phone numbers that appeared on the billing record. Isn't that correct? Jay said, again, yes, ma'am. And he was asked, you were shown the billing records of Adnan Syed, right? Jay said, yes, ma'am. And that helped trigger your memory about what things you did that day, did they not? Again, Jay said, yes, ma'am. And you were asked about a lot of different numbers, were you not? Yes, ma'am. Only one of them was Patrick Furlow, isn't that right? Yes, ma'am. So were you asked about who called that day, sir? And Jay said, yes, ma'am. And who you called on Adnan Syed's phone? Jay again said, yes. Yes, and so you were asked about various times that you called your friend, Jen Pusateri. Isn't that true? Jay responded, yes, ma'am. And that included her residence number? Yes, ma'am. And her pager number? Yes, ma'am. And calls to her residence or her pager were made by you, were they not? Yes, ma'am. Jen Pusateri was not a friend of Adnan Syed's, was she? Jay said, not to my knowledge. No. And if he was, you would know, would you not? And he responded, that's an assumption.
So something Alice said earlier, I think, is important here. All of this is being put in front of the jury. It wasn't a mystery to the jury that the police were using the records that they had to confront Jay and adjust his statement. And in fact, the defense spent a good amount of time with two different witnesses going into this. Now, could they have spent even more time on this, going into the differences between Jay's first and second statement? Yes, maybe they should have. You can criticize them for that if you want to. But it is unquestionably the case that the jury was well aware that the police confronted Jay with this cell data that they had retrieved, and that it resulted in Jay's story shifting to match it. If they were hiding it by tapping at the time, they certainly were hiding it when they got to the jury. But the problem for the defense is that much of this is just the specific time that stuff happened. It doesn't change the story itself. Jay's initial statement to the police before they would have had this information and before they were tapping on the table contains significant touch points that never change. Jay gets a call from Adnan to pick him up while Jay is at Jen's house. He drives to meet Adnan where he pops the truck, and there is Hay. They drop the car off at the I-70 parking ride. Afterwards, Jay takes Adnan to school so he can be seen at practice. He then picks him up. Adnan got a call from the cops saying Hay was dead. Adnan freaked out. They buried her body in Leakin Park. They dumped the car where Jay would take the police to find it, and during the struggle, Hay had kicked off the windshield wiper thing, as Jay would describe it, which would indeed be found dangling from the steering column. The timeline may change, but the location is set. It's kind of like a song where Jay has provided the lyrics and the cops are providing the beat. And to the extent that they are changing things, it really is just moving sometimes here and there. They do add some things. Christy Vinson's trips is one of them. Jay is going to say, he's going to testify about this, and he's going to say essentially, look, I didn't want to get Christy involved. And I think if you want to criticize Christina Gutierrez for not diving into this more, I think you have to remember she was well aware that her biggest problem is Jen and Jay's first statement. So it does not help her as much as people want to focus on it now. It doesn't help her as much at trial to knock this second statement. All it really shows is that Jay is willing to shift his story to make the police happy, but she really has to get at that first statement by Jay and the statement by Jen. So to me, and I know people think this is a big deal, and look, if you want to think that the police shouldn't have done that, or they should have been more open about it, or instead of tapping on the table, they should have, I don't know, said something to make it clear on the tape that we are now showing him the records. Fine. That's a fine criticism. As we said last time, if there had been a lawyer in the room with Jay, that would have taken care of a lot of this stuff, but it's not a big secret. It wasn't a big secret that got uncovered 15 years after Adnan was convicted. It was something everybody knew about, and something that in fact had been brought up to the jury.
And I think that's a really important point to make, Brett, because, you know, a lot of the gotchas are like, oh, no one knew about this. It does make a difference when it's all brought out to open court and the jury gets to hear it and weigh it, right? That's the purpose of a jury, is to be able to weigh the credibility of different witnesses. And you see from reading the cross-examination, the direct, the redirect, the recross, that, you know, the attorneys were having this exact debate in front of the jury. And the jury gets to decide kind of which way of reading the situation is most probable. And, you know, this isn't the only fact that they had to weigh, but it is important because this is not like a gotcha moment. This is not a, oh my goodness, they've kept this hidden. You know, what the police did with verifying testimony with like cell phone records is very commonplace and in fact good police work, but also it is not something that we are discovering many, many decades later.
And this is one of those disconnects we run into sometimes, and I try and not fall victim to. And we talk about this sometimes on Legal Briefs, where we'll talk about subpoenas or warrants or searches and all that stuff, and how it's just so familiar to us, but the average person out there doesn't know. So I think the average person, they hear, oh wait, the police, they were prepping him, they were using documents, they should have just taken his story. What are they doing? Why are they showing him documents? And you even get this in trial. If you ever watch a trial or you serve on a jury, at some point the defense is going to ask a witness, you were prepped by the government, weren't you? They sat down with you, and they'll say something in closing argument along the lines of, how many practices does it take to tell the truth? And it's a pretty, you know, it's a powerful thing, and every defense attorney uses it. And I feel like that was sort of amped up 1,000 times for this case to make this not only something that should have made you question Jay's credibility, but something deeply nefarious, where this just means that the police are absolutely corrupt and you can't believe anything Jay said because, you know, this timeline was created. It didn't happen. It was created by the police in this second interview. And I'm sorry, that's just not the case. So those are the interviews. Probably not going to talk too much more about that. And of course, they lead up to Jay testifying at trial. And in fact, Jay's trial testimony will get interesting before it even begins. As he is walking to the witness stand, Adnan calls him pathetic. Some people think this is an interesting choice of words, as he called him pathetic rather than a liar. This ends up resulting in a sidebar, and everyone's admonished not to let anything like that happen again. Jay gets on the stand and he testifies that he started selling marijuana in 10th grade because he needed lacrosse equipment. Jay is a real sympathetic figure. He honestly seems like a guy who was pretty smart and probably could have done a lot with his life. And from what I understand, frankly, has done a lot with his life since all this happened. But he had some real tragedies in his life. I believe his dad passed away, and his mom had a lot of issues too, and he sort of bounced back and forth between his grandma's house. Didn't have a lot of money, and so he started selling marijuana to buy lacrosse equipment. He says that he and Adnan are acquaintances, but not friends. This is something that I am absolutely fascinated by. We talked about this when we talked about the timeline, about how close are these guys. Seems like they're closer than either one of them wants to let on. Seems like they're really close. One thing that's fascinating to me, if I'm the prosecution and I'm the cops, I really don't like this answer. I want Adnan to be Jay's bosom buddy. I want him to be the guy he trusts more than anybody. They're in it through thick and thin, and that's why Adnan went to Jay, because he's the guy he trusts above all others. But even by the time we get to trial, Jay's like, yeah, we were just acquaintances. we weren't that close. We hung out a few times, and it was always through Stephanie, who was Jay's girlfriend. He goes on to say that he talked to Adnan on his birthday, which was the day before the murder, and Adnan asked him if he was doing anything, to which he said he had nothing going on. But Adnan, it didn't really tell him anything else, and the state confirms that there were phone call records between Adnan and Jay. And this is one of those things where, is this true or not? How much had Adnan shared and how early did he share it? But now Jay he's laying down the marker. We're in trial, and this is the story that he's telling. Jay will say that Adnan called him and told him he'd give him a lift to the mall to pick up something for Stephanie. And this is the day of the murders. And on the way back to school, Adnan said he was going to, quote unquote, kill that bitch, referring to Hay. But Jay didn't take him all that seriously. Adnan leaves his cell phone and car with Jay and asks him to do him a favor. Pick him up later in the day when he gives him a phone call. And Jay agrees.
So then Jay calls Jen's house, but her brother Mark is home alone, so he goes over there to see him. Adnan called to see if the phone was on, and then later on he called Jay and told him he needed him to pick him up around 3:45. Jay says that at some point Adnan calls him again and tells him to meet at the Best Buy. Adnan's standing by the payphone, wearing red gloves. He directs Jay to a vehicle that turns out to be Hay's car, and Jay lit a cigarette, and Adnan asked him if he was ready for this. It was then that Adnan opened the trunk, and Hay was inside, laying face down. Jay said that he couldn't see Hay's face, and her skin was blue, and she was obviously dead. Jay dropped his cigarette and stumbled backwards. After a few seconds, Adnan closed the trunk. Adnan told him to follow him, which he did in shock. And they went to the I-70 park and ride and dropped off Hay's car. Then they drive around for a while. They buy some weed. And that's when Jay drops Adnan off at track practice back at school. Adnan mentioned that Hay had scratched his face, and he hoped there was no evidence under her fingernails. He also said that while Adnan was strangling her, she kicked off the turn signal bar on her car. Adnan says that he thought she was telling him she was sorry. Jay repeats the story from his statement to the police that Adnan joked that MFers think they're hard, but he killed someone with his bare hands.
And this is pretty powerful testimony, obviously. And Jay, he does a really good job with this. And the state does a really good job of keeping this short. Jay is not on the stand for very long. He tells this story and the state gets him off, which is exactly what you want to do when you have a witness who is not always solid and can kind of drift off on tangents. You want to get them on, get the story out, and get them off. And that's what the state's doing. Jay recounts that he picked up Adnan and they go to Christy Vinson's house. Adnan gets the phone call from the police that we talked about before, and he drives Jay back to his house. But at this point, he decides they need to bury Hay. So it's sort of initially Adnan is just going to drop Jay off, but now he's like, no, we've got to bury Hay. At this point, Adnan basically threatens Jay, says, look, I know you're a drug dealer. I know everything you're into. And Jay is sensitive to this because he lived at his grandmother's house and he didn't want to get her into trouble. At this point, they go to Leakin Park. They dig this grave. When we talk about digging the grave, what they really did is there was already a depression and they kind of made it a little deeper, put Hay in it, and covered her up. So it's not like, they're digging a grave, a 6-foot deep grave or anything like that. Jen called Adnan's phone while they were there, but Adnan told her that they were busy and hung up. Jay says that at this point he sat down on a log that was close to the grave and smoked a cigarette. He then followed Adnan. Jay is in Adnan's car. Adnan is in Hay's car. Jay follows Adnan until he pulls into an alcove behind some apartments where he ditched Hay's car. At this point, they go back to the mall and pull up to some dumpsters. Adnan is flipping through Hay's wallet, and this is a really sort of visceral moment in the testimony. Adnan's flipping through Hay's wallet, and he comes to their prom picture, and he shows it to Jay, and then he throws everything in the dumpster. They then throw away the shovels. Adnan took Jay home, and he paged Jen. He put his clothes in a bag. Jen picks him up. He puts the shovels in her car and then drives to a store where he dumps the evidence in a dumpster. He tells Jen what happened because he wants at least one person to know what really happened. This is that sort of weird inconsistency that I don't really know the purpose of, and I'm not really sure who's telling the truth, but Jen always says she picks him up in the mall parking lot. Jay always says that she picks him up at his home. But in any event, he tells her in the mall parking lot, but he says it was when they went back to make sure that the shovels were all taken care of, not earlier when she picks him up. Fairly minor inconsistency, but an inconsistency nevertheless. He says later Adnan threatened to hurt Stephanie if Jay ever talked. The prosecution admits Jay's plea agreement for accessory after the fact and discusses his cooperation agreement. Then the prosecution tenders Jay to the defense. This is also very common. You want to front the fact that the person that is testifying has a benefit they are receiving, because the defense absolutely is going to get into that. And in fact, that's what the defense spends a good amount of time on in the beginning of this cross-examination.
Brett, before we move on, I am so excited about one of our favorite sponsors, HelloFresh. I know you guys are tired of hearing me talk about how busy I am with work, with 3 kids, with the podcasts, and I can barely think about going to the grocery store, much less what to cook at least 3 times a day to feed my children. Well, enter HelloFresh. With HelloFresh, you get farm fresh, pre-portioned ingredients and seasonal recipes delivered right to your doorstep. Skip trips to the grocery store and count on HelloFresh to make home cooking easy, fun, and affordable. That's why it's America's #1 meal kit. Fall is right around the corner. I can't believe it. And HelloFresh is here to help you plan for the busy season ahead with tasty dishes delivered to your door. Simply choose your recipes and pick your delivery date. Then lay back and enjoy the last days of summer knowing dinner is covered. And the key to dinner time success? Variety. HelloFresh keeps your taste buds on their toes with 40 chef-crafted recipes to select from every week. From family-friendly to fit and wholesome, you'll always find new and exciting recipes to try and love.
And Alice, I know I've said it once, there are 1,000 great recipes from HelloFresh, but I absolutely love the firecracker meatballs. You guys need to join HelloFresh, if for no other reason than to have the firecracker meatballs. I remember the last time we got our HelloFresh, my wife and I, we just dropped off the kids. We were walking back home and we're thinking, man, we got to come up with something to make for dinner tonight. And then we remembered HelloFresh was on the way, and we made those firecracker meatballs. And not only did we love them, but our kids loved them. Our kids were saying, yay, firecracker meatballs just like yours, Alice. So if you're out there and you are looking to make your life easier, simpler, and to eat better, banish the end of summer blues with HelloFresh. Go to HelloFresh.com/50TP and use code 50TP for 50% off plus free shipping. That's HelloFresh.com/50TP and code 50TP for 50% off plus free shipping. And you will find out why HelloFresh is America's #1 meal kit. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Alice, if there is one thing that everybody goes through, it is uncertainty, it is difficulties. It's periods in your life where you just wish you had somebody to talk to, somebody to help you get through it. And that's where BetterHelp can come in. Sometimes we're faced with a crossroads in life and we don't know which path to take. Maybe you're thinking about a career change or feeling like your relationship needs some TLC. Whatever it is, therapy can help you map out your future, and you can trust yourself to find a way forward. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapist anytime for no additional charge.
Brett, I think it's so important to talk about this because it's helpful for everybody to learn positive coping skills and how to set boundaries, and it empowers you to be the best version of yourself. It isn't just for those who've experienced major trauma. I think really just about anyone can benefit from therapy. Let therapy be your map with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/prosecutors today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/prosecutors. Angie has made it easier than ever to connect with skilled professionals to get all your home projects done well. If you own a home, you know how much work it can take. Whether it's everyday maintenance and repairs or making dream projects a reality, it can be hard just to know where to start. But now, all you need to do is Angie that and find a skilled local pro who will deliver the quality and expertise you need.
And Alice, you can turn to Angie with confidence no matter what the size of your home or the size of your project. Whether you've got a 100-year-old house like I do, where it seems like things are always breaking, or if you're renting and you're needing someone to help you with moving, installations, or cleaning, Angie is there for you, and they're there for you with confidence. So, Angie has over 20 years of home service experience, and they've combined it with new tools to simplify the whole process. Bring them your project online or with Angie's app, answer a few questions, and Angie can handle the rest from start to finish. Or they can help you compare quotes from multiple pros and connect instantly, which means you can take care of just about any home project in just a few taps. Because when it comes to getting the most out of your home, you can do this when you Angie that. Download the free Angie mobile app today or visit Angie.com. That's ANGI.com. Check them out today. Angie.com. ANGI.com.
So, Brett, going back to kind of the beginning when we were talking about how Jay says that Adnan and he are not that close, they're acquaintances, and how kind of mind-boggling that is. I know we talked about that in the context of Adnan saying that he and Jay were not close, but here we have Jay saying it as well. And I've thought about this a lot. And I think what you just said might be the key to how this might make sense, at least in my mind. Jay testifies that Adnan threatens to hurt Stephanie if Jay ever talked. We know that Stephanie and Adnan are very close, like the best of friends, right? Very, 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 very close. And of course, Jay and Stephanie are dating. Now, I'm thinking about my best friends and their significant others. I almost by proxy am a lot closer to them because of our shared contact. This isn't with every person I'm close with, but I'm talking about like the closest people to me, and it's only like a handful of them. I would, in passing, kind of count their spouses or their significant others as someone that I know very well by proxy, by transitive property, because I'm so close to that friend. But when it comes down to it, and if I were being interrogated by the police and someone said, "How well do you know that person?" the reality would be like, I don't actually know my best friend's significant other that well. I don't know their favorite movie. Wouldn't hang out with them independently. I hang out with them because of my best friend. And so when you're removed from the situation of having to describe your friendship, I would feel a lot closer to that person than if I were actually asked. Like if a tragedy struck or they were arrested, and someone asked me, like, how well did you know them? And I had to think about it and remove my best friend, the relationship I had closest with from the equation. All of a sudden, that relationship seems a lot more arm's length than it did when you inserted, say, my best friend. And so I wonder if that's something at play here, which is that if they were asked before this whole situation, are y'all close? It probably would have been more like, yeah, we hang, we're cool, we're good. But really, it's because of Stephanie that matters. And I think this matters because normally when you think about wanting to cover up a crime, or we always think of like, my best friend is the one who I would call to dig a hole to bury a body as a joke. Here, it's like he's leveraging Stephanie's friendship, knowing how close he is to Stephanie, that almost by transitive property, Jay carries that amount of loyalty that Stephanie has, even though Jay doesn't know him that well. And if anything, he knows that he can leverage his relationship with Stephanie to keep Jay from talking. So I don't think that's like noble or right or at anything like that, but I'm trying to understand why Adnan would pick someone who he didn't even know that well to help him bury Hayes' body. And if it's the transitive property of who Stephanie is and the loyalty that Stephanie has for him, not that she would necessarily bury a body for him, but importing that relationship to Jay may make sense until you then sit down and say, how well do you know Jay? Or how well do you know Adnan? And the answer is, I don't really know that person that well when you remove Stephanie from the equation, which is why I think he mentions Stephanie at the end of all this to Jay, and why Jay says to Stephanie, stay away from Adnan without telling Stephanie what it is. Stephanie has something to do with all of this in the sense that I don't think Jay would be part of this if it were not Stephanie and her close relationship to Adnan. Yeah,
it's a fascinating question. The thing that's interesting about this whole case is it feels like you kind of needed an accomplice. I mean, whoever did it kind of needed an accomplice because of Hayes' car and moving Hayes' car and burying her body and all that stuff, that you couldn't really do it by yourself. Maybe you could, but I think most people, they kind of end up pairing somebody off. So, people who think that Jay's involved kind of think Jen might have been involved. Maybe she was the accomplice. And then obviously Adnan and Jay. And, who knows with some of the other people who were ancillary. And I think if Adnan did this, he probably did feel like he needed somebody to help him. He didn't think he could get away with it by himself. And Jay, and this is pure speculation, but the sort of Jay being the criminal element, Adnan can't ask any of his friends. None of his friends, his good friends, are going to help him. They're not going to help him do this. He needs somebody like Jay. It's kind of, we talked about this before, it's kind of that weird phenomenon where sometimes when you do bad things, the things that aren't like you, they're not the things you share with your close friends. You don't let your hair down in front of your close friends. You actually do it with people you barely know, right? And I don't know, I guess that's a possibility, but I think to me, it's really interesting that Jay never wavers from this. He may change his story on a lot, but one thing he never changes his story on is he and Adnan, according to him, weren't that close.
So interestingly, despite saying in the opening statement that the call to come pick him up at Best Buy happened at 2:36, that isn't really the story Jay tells at all. In fact, it's pretty clear that Jay is saying the call to get Adnan happened later. The prosecution kind of just lets this go, though. And it's not the only time this happens at trial. When Jen Pusateri testifies, she also says that Jay left her house after 3 o'clock, as late as 3:45. She certainly doesn't say he left in the 2 o'clock hour. And in fact, Jen was late leaving work that day due to some issues at her pool where she was a lifeguard. So it's likely that she wouldn't have seen Jay if he'd left early enough for the prosecution's timeline to work. But cross-examination is pretty standard. Gutierrez talks about Jay's guilty plea, the fact he initially lied to the police, the fact he was prepared by the prosecution, and prepped on the cell phone data locations. Gutierrez also does more with the cell phone data than the state, pointing out tower pings and, in a weird way, actually confirming some of Jay's testimony with the data. It's not entirely clear what she's trying to accomplish in doing so. And in fact, at this point, something unusual happens. They break for the weekend, and on Monday, after the cell phone expert testifies, then Jay is back on the stand. And he's on the stand for the better part of 5 days. And why this is weird, by the way, is typically once a witness takes the stand, they have to stay on the stand until you're done with them. This is just like a rule because you don't want them coming off. You don't want kind of breaks in their testimony. You want consistency for what the jury's hearing. And so this doesn't always happen, but it can happen if, say, you have someone flying in, an expert for like a short, like a document custodian testimony, and they're only in for like a day, and then they have to like fly out to, I don't know, go get married or something like that. So we've seen it happen before, but it's not typical that you would take a break in someone's testimony.
And one thing I want to talk about, this focus on the cell phone. If you look at this testimony, she spends a lot more time with the cell phone than the prosecution does, at least with Jay. There's a couple possibilities there. Could be the prosecution's afraid that just the longer they spend with Jay, the more he's going to sort of veer off. But it could also be that I really think her theory of this case, and the only way she thought that it was possible for Adnan to succeed, was if everybody thought Jay did it. And if, in fact, everybody thought Jay kind of did it with Jen. We're going to talk about that more, about this focus on Jen, because it happens a lot in this cross-examination. And I think she basically wants to show you were with the cell phone in all these different places when all this was happening. You're saying Adnan was with you, but you're putting yourself every single place you would need to be in order for this murder to happen exactly as you're saying it happened, but it just being you. And I think that's what she's trying to do with this. The last point Alice makes, Jay on direct, it's short. He's on the stand for cross for days on end. And you can criticize Gutierrez, and people do, but she gives it to Jay. I mean, she cross-examines him for a long time, maybe even too long. Cross-examination is an art, not a science. Some people will tell you, you really should, pick 3 things and really focus on that and get off. Because if you cross-examine for too long, it loses its effectiveness. I don't know if that's what happened here or not, but she certainly There are things that we call slow guilty pleas. And when you're prosecutor or defense attorney, you've probably heard of those. It's basically when everybody knows guy's guilty, he wants a trial, we're going to give him a trial, but really this is a slow guilty plea because there is no case and the defense doesn't have anything the prosecution's going to put on its evidence, and the jury's going to convict. And there were people who felt like this was a slow guilty plea. In fact, Jay's lawyer, we were able to talk to her, and she said that's what this was. It was a slow guilty plea. Adnan was obviously guilty. He was going to be found guilty, and that's what happened. But Christina doesn't act like that. She doesn't ask Jay a few questions and get him off the stand. She keeps him on the stand for several days.
And that's a really great point, Brett. This is everything that you guys want to ask Jay. Gutierrez basically does this. 5 days is a really, really long time to be on the stand, and most of that was in cross-examination. Gutierrez talks a lot about the inconsistencies between Jay's statements, repeatedly pointing out his lies. In other words, all the things that kind of to be critical about Jay on, Gutierrez absolutely underlines it and underlines it again and again and again for the jury to hear. And here, actually, Jay is kind of a dream witness. He owns the lies. He doesn't try to skirt them, because when Gutierrez asks if he was lying, Jay simply says, yes, ma'am. I mean, you heard the transcript. He says, yes, ma'am, like across the board. He doesn't try to run from it. He doesn't try to qualify. He just owns it. Yes, ma'am, I lied. And Gutierrez also spent a lot of time on Jay's, quote, very good friend, Jen Pusateri. Gutierrez seems to recognize something modern commentators don't. It's impossible to completely discredit Jay based on his changing story to the police because he'd already told essentially the same story to Jen. So Jen also needs to be discredited. So Gutierrez tries to tie the two of them so tightly together that a jury would, one, believe they were in a physical or romantic relationship, and two, think that they were the ones together in some way on this murder that somehow exonerates Adnan. And by the way, it's a really good tactic because she gets it. Jen Pusateri's statement to the police is really problematic for the defense. And even if you completely discount everything Jay says, I mean, Jen basically says the exact same thing with, remember, the lawyer in the room and her mom in the room, and she never wavers.
Yeah, and I think this is her best bet because, as we've said, all you need is reasonable doubt. You know, she doesn't have to prove that Jay and Jen killed Hay, but she just needs someone on the jury to think it's possible. And look, I mean, this has been the strategy, essentially, for people who defend Adnan for a long time. I mean, the strategy changes and the target of who might have killed Hay changes, but Jay is always there. You know, there's always a substantial group of people in this case who think it was Jay, and a lot of them think Jen was involved. So I think this was a pretty good strategy by Gutierrez, even if it doesn't work. So at the conclusion of this very long, very thorough cross, the prosecution, they do something pretty clever. They don't just let Jay go. They do a redirect, but it's a pretty brief redirect. But in it, they identify the three main differences between Jay's first and second statements, and they ask him about them. So they say, I'd like to address the three actual changes between the first and second taped statement at this time. The first change in the tape statement, you said that you met the defendant at the McDonald's in Edmondson or the Strip on Edmondson, and that was where he popped the trunk and showed you the body. In the second statement, you said it was the parking lot at Best Buy. Yes, sir. Now, why did that change between the first and second statement? Or why did you not say in the first statement what you said in the second one? He says the significance of Best Buy, I didn't want to, bring anything out that didn't need to be brought out about Hay. And what was the significance of Best Buy? That's where her and Mr. Syed used to have intercourse. Used to what? And then Gutierrez says, I'm sorry, I didn't hear that. Which I guess means that when Jay is saying this, like his voice is dropping. And when you read these things in cold transcripts, it's often hard to parse that. But this is interesting because he's saying something that basically he says he didn't want to say. And when he says the thing he didn't want to say, he apparently says it so low that both the prosecution and the defense attorney don't really hear it. And so he repeats where her and Mr. Syed used to have intercourse. Interesting thing about this, Jay lies to the police about Best Buy. He didn't lie to Jen. If you remember, Jen comes in and says this happened at the Best Buy. So when he told Jen that story, he told the truth. When he told the police that, he shades the truth. The other thing, we know now from Adnan's own statement to his defense counsel, which we now have, that in fact they did have sex at the Best Buy regularly after school, between when they left school and when she would go pick up her cousin. So this thing that Jay is saying seems to be true, the fact that they did indeed have sex at the Best Buy. And then the prosecution goes on to say, that's in the parking lot beside the Best Buy. Yes, sir. Somewhat secluded from observations. Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir. I'm sorry. Which is also obviously a good point for the prosecution to make, because those of us who've never been to the Best Buy, have no idea whether or not strangling someone in the Best Buy would be a crazy thing to do. But if this is a place where they're having sex and it's a place that's secluded, it actually is a pretty good place to commit a murder. He then goes on to the second difference. He says the second difference between the first statement and the second one, you said in the first one that when the calls came in from the Baltimore County police officer and Hayes' family, that you and the defendant were at a McDonald's. Yes, sir. In the second statement, he said that those came out while you were at Christy Vinson's. Why was the change between the first statement and the second statement? He says because they now knew about Miss Vinson. And what were you trying to do in your first statement? Protect Miss Vinson. Her father is a police officer.
That makes total sense. Like, he has answers to why he made these lies. Is it okay that he lied? No. But I will say these are all very probable answers and probable reasons why people would lie.
It's kind of funny. This is one of those things where if you think Jay is like a bad guy, then a lot of these won't ring true. If you think Jay is kind of probably a good guy who got in a really bad situation and did a bad thing, then these statements might ring true. But obviously we don't know Jay, so it's hard to say whether or not these are believable or not. But Jay is, with his first two answers, he's giving answers where basically, hey, I was trying to protect people. Number one, I was trying to protect Hay, and number two, I was trying to protect Christy Vinson. The third difference between the two statements. In the first statement, you don't mention that Adnan dropped you off at Jennifer Pusateri. You basically don't mention Jen Pusateri. In the second one, you say he dropped you off to meet Jen Pusateri. Why does Jen Pusateri not appear in the first statement but appear in the second one? I wasn't trying to give her name to the police. I was trying to protect her. I was not trying to give her name to the police. She had no involvement. So that is also consistent with his answer about Christy Vinson, that essentially the reason the stories change in a pretty significant way is these are people he's trying to keep out of it if he can. If he can tell the police the story without having to involve these people, he's not going to involve them. The prosecution, they then give Jay the cell phone records, and they go through each call, all interspersed, noting that some of the calls are to people Jay knew and some of the calls were to people Adnan knew, indicating that they were together the whole time. And then the prosecution wraps things up with a question and an answer that may go a long way to humanizing Jay for the jury and explaining some of his actions. One of the very final questions they ask him. Okay, in response to questions from Ms. Gutierrez when she was asking you about looking at Hayes' body in the trunk, you said that the incident stuck with you. Why did the incident stick with you? He says, I've never seen anyone dead before, and I guess he wasn't speaking very, very loudly. So Ms. Gutierrez says, Judge, I can't hear the witness, which the judge overrules her, but she's not objecting. But in any event, she's pointing out she can't hear him, so I guess he speaks up. And he says, I've never seen anyone dead before, and the first thing I thought was how fragile Stephanie was, and I think that's why it stuck with me so much. And that's a great way to end the examination of your lead witness.
Yeah, I mean, look, we've read it to you by transcript. We don't know Jay. We didn't hear the entire testimony, but I thought these 3 points it was incredibly effective of the prosecution to also own the fact that there are inconsistencies in a statement. But again, the prosecution knows this exists in every witness, basically. You have inconsistencies. Basically, if you talk to one witness more than once, you will have inconsistencies. But I think these are important inconsistencies. They're big ones. And Jay has, to me, believable answers for what they are. Now, is it also maybe convenient that each of these lies were meant to protect another woman, another girl? Maybe. It certainly makes him seem a lot more chivalrous. You know, he's protecting Hayes' honor. He's protecting Christy Vinson and, of course, Jen Pusateri from the police going to further investigate with them because he doesn't want them to be pulled into it. But you can see someone doing that as well. We see that happen all the time. And it makes sense here because Christy Vincent, he may not know that well, but Christy is very close to Jen Pusateri. And Jen Pusateri is one of his best friends. And if she truly had nothing to do with it, he doesn't want to drag her into this thing, right? And with Hay, he doesn't know Hay that well either, but you will bet your bottom dollar that the police would follow up on why that location. And he'd probably have to go into why that location, because why pick this parking lot over another one? You know, how do you know it's secluded enough? I knew it was secluded enough because that's where they had sex. You know, that's very possibly the reason, right? Because when I'm thinking about a parking lot, I'm like, that seems like a very risky place to do it, unless it's someplace that's secluded enough that you could even have sex and not be caught, right? Because you know, the police don't let you have sex in public places either. They would definitely stop you if they found you. So it was certainly secluded enough that they were able to have sex there multiple times and never be caught.
And one thing that I'll just say, if these are lies by Jay, calculated lies to make him sound better, that's pretty sophisticated thinking, pretty sophisticated action. And we talk about this case, we've been talking about this case for 10 episodes now, and sometimes we fall into this trap, too, of treating all of these people as if they are adults. They are not. None of them are, including Jay. I think Jay is probably the oldest, but he's, 19? He's 1 year out of high school. Jen is, I think, 1 year out of high school. Adnan's 17 years old. Hayes 18. You know, there's a lot of a lot of these actions are very much driven by youth. And frankly, I think I can imagine Jay being a younger person being more driven by actually keeping people out of it than if he were a little bit older, maybe thinking about himself more, you know? and maybe that's not true. And I'm not saying that young people can't be devious and awful and terrible and everything else. And maybe Jay was being that, but I don't know. You know, I'm going to say something controversial, which I've never done before. So I hope everybody's ready for this. But we started this whole podcast off with some things that we said we weren't going to fight about. And one of them was that Jay lies a lot and that Jay tells a lot of lies. And I'm not saying Jay doesn't lie, and I'm not saying he didn't lie. But honestly, now that we've finished going through his statements and his testimony, I don't think Jay is that unusual. I think one of the sort of starting principles for everyone who discusses this case is the starting assumption that Jay is like a liar of a great magnitude, that he is far more of a liar than your average person who is a witness in a crime, and that he is so far beyond anything you see. And honestly, that's just not true. That's just, in my experience, it's just not true. Jay seems a lot like the average witness that you're going to have in a case where one of the people testifying is someone who's involved and who has things to hide.
And I would actually go as far to say that his explanations for why he lies is above average. Oftentimes when we do confront witnesses with their inconsistent statements, they don't have a good reason. I forgot. I don't know. Typically, we don't actually get such coherent explanations for why the lies are lies. And so with that, I agree with you, Brett. I mean, he kind of is inconsistent in the same ways and changes not quite. Well, yes, he does change his story when he's confronted with evidence. That happens all the time with us. We slap down documents in front of witnesses and say, like, you say you never go to this store. Here you are on security camera. Now what? Then they change their story. This all happens all the time. And like you said, I think Jay is very typical, except for the way that he's able to explain these lies. Because I would say a lot of the witnesses that I've confronted who are confronted with their lies, can't explain why they lie.
And look, this is not the last time we'll talk about Jay, obviously, as we sort of move through this. And Jay's credibility is an important point. Whether you believe Jay is important, I think as we sort of wrap up on Jay, one thing that I think really comes out in the prosecution's direct of him and the way he handles the cross-examination is the reminder that whatever you think about that second interview, the second taped interview where the police, they spent a couple hours, 3 hours with him before they even turn the tape on. Maybe they're tapping on the table to help him get his times right. That is the interview where if there's coaching and all other stuff happening, that's where it really happens. But that's the second interview. And his first interview is consistent with what Jen says, with the exception that he lies about things to protect other people, including Jen. Jen, who just sort of like walks in and admits to being accessory after the fact to murder. Jay is trying to protect her while he's telling that story. I mean, whether he's trying to or not, he does. I mean, he leaves her out. Well, for whatever reason he's lying, he absolutely leaves her out and tells a different story than what Jen says, and one that he ends up sort of coming to once he admits Jen's involvement and everything else. Those two statements exist, and those two statements contain really important facts. And I think that probably was powerful for the jury. And I think it was one of the reasons that Gutierrez really tried to tie Jen and Jay together, because it is really hard to get past those statements. The inconsistencies don't help you much when the first statement really hurts you. It would be one thing if Jen's first statement didn't really hurt Adnan very much, and then his second statement is where he talked about the park and ride and burying hay and where they dropped off the car and everything else. If all that came out in the second statement, okay, that's, now we're off to the races. But the fact that all that comes out in the first one, I mean, the inconsistencies hurt, and she points them out, but they're not as powerful as maybe some people want to make them out to be now. Okay, Alice, I think we're going to wrap up for today. Do you have time for a question, though?
Absolutely.
I want to, I feel like I did a bad job explaining the rules of the questions. So I'm going to give you guys a couple updated rules.
Are there rules? I don't think there were rules.
There are now rules. Number one, you have to leave them a 5-star review, which everybody knew. But one rule. It's not really a rule. It's a suggestion. The better way to suggest cases to us is to email us. Email us at prosecutorspod@gmail.com if you really want to hear a case. If you want to leave in the 5-star review, you can. You can do that. But the better way to do it is to email us. So not really a rule, just a suggestion. The second one is a rule, though. The question you ask cannot be for legal advice. We cannot give you legal advice.
I did notice that, and that was kind of sneaky.
Kind of sneaky. We can't give you legal advice. So if you need legal advice, my suggestion to you is you should find a good lawyer in your neighborhood who specializes in the area that you need legal advice on. That is a better way to get legal advice than 5-star reviews. Though we appreciate the 5-star review. We absolutely do. So just wanted to sort of remind you guys of that. Okay, with that said, here's a great one. From Abigail, we recently brought, and let me just say, those of you in the chat, feel free to help out on this one. Abigail says, we recently bought a bright yellow 1947 Chevy pickup. Can you give us some name suggestions? We are strongly considering Brittany.
I was going to say Brittany. She's like Sunshine.
Oh, there you go. Sunshine. Tweety Bird. Tweety Bird.
Okay, so it's bright yellow.
Bright yellow.
Great number. Okay, Tweety Bird is pretty good.
Chevy pickup.
Does it have to be prosecutors themed? Let's see.
Lemon? Well, you don't want to call your car.
Yeah,
Lemon.
Big Bird. Having to think like a pun on the spot is
bad.
Well,
a banana. Daphne suggests. I like that.
That's pretty good because.
Like
have you guys read the book? This is like my life right now. Richard Scarry's Cars and Things That Go, something like that. It's about like funny cars, but there's a banana mobile that my kids find hilarious. It's literally just like a car that's a banana with wheels, and they call it a banana mobile, and it's like sends them into fits of laughter for an hour.
I'm gonna go with The King in Yellow, which is a horror reference. So you might not want to do that, but it's a great book if you haven't read it. If you're out there looking for something to read, which if you've ever seen True Detective was inspired by The King in Yellow, which you may have noticed. But anyways, I think those are our best options. Canary, we've got Yellow Submarine.
Yellow Submarine's pretty good.
Yellow Submarine.
Actually, Yellow Submarine's fantastic.
That's another good one. Bananarama.
Lemonade.
The chat has some great ones. Lemonade. Yeah, Luigi from Cars. You could also go with Wario, who is Mario's nemesis, who wears a yellow hat. So there's that. Banana Split. I kind of like that.
Ooh, Banana Split's fantastic.
Banana Split. I like that. Yeah. Old Yeller makes me sad.
Old Yeller. Oh.
You don't want it to die on the side of the road.
No, that's akin to lemon.
Yeah. Okay, so that's one. Let's do one more. Do you guys have any legal shows or movies centered around lawyers that you like or think are accurate?
Movies, or the thing is, movies and TV always make being a lawyer seem a lot sexier than it actually is.
Yeah. I mean, My Cousin Vinny's pretty good. It's a pretty good one.
It's legally accurate, but like, and you know, it's a hilarious movie. It's fantastic acting. But
I
like,
mean, Law and
our life
Order,
is
the
not as
old Law
exciting.
and Order was pretty good. I feel like the new one's not, but the old Law and Order, I think, did a pretty good job. I mean, their cases were all way more exciting, and they always went to trial. I mean, there was
I started
that.
watching some new, was it Netflix show? Was it like Making Partner? Like it has the lead is an Asian woman who's like trying to make partner. Anyways, life is not as sexy as that show. Like they're like, you know, partying on rooftops in the middle of the day with like martinis and trying to make partner by like, you know, working their tails off, and everyone's like dressed to the nines. I'm like, it's one or the other, guys. You work your tail off or you look good. It's not, you can't be both.
The one accurate thing about Ally McBeal was that they had a bar in the basement. The inaccurate thing was that they went down and partied all the time, as opposed to just going down there and drinking. So, I mean, I don't know. It's like everything else. Everybody who has a profession that ends up on television will tell you it's nowhere near that exciting. Whether it's firefighters or police officers or doctors or lawyers, it's just not that exciting. So, anyway.
It's true. Actually, Legally Blonde is pretty good.
Legally Blonde
That's of law
is
school.
very accurate about
It's
law school.
accurate of law school, but law school's way more fun than being a lawyer.
Way more fun.
I had way more fun in law school than being a lawyer.
Same. Law school is way more fun than being a lawyer. Okay, well, I think that's enough for now. Look, this probably is going to be a controversial episode because we basically said that half the things people say are like irrelevant. So I'm sure we're going to hear from that.
I don't think
If
we
you wanna-
started it in this episode, but maybe
If
they
you-
woke up now.
Right, exactly. If you want to tell us how wrong we are, shoot us an email, prosecutorspod@gmail.com, @prosecutorspod, on all your social media. We just joined this new Facebook social media thing. I don't even know what it's called, Threads. So, you know, follow us on Threads, I guess. Hello to everybody in the chat room. You guys are awesome. We love talking to you.
How many are there now?
142.
Wow.
So it's good to have you guys. Thanks for sticking it out. I realized we were a little goofy this time, but appreciate you all. If you're interested in taking part in these live recordings, join Patreon. We'd love to have you. Hello to everyone on YouTube. You guys are awesome. Well, Alice, is there anything else you want to say before we sign off for today?
No, I think as you know, what we've done in this episode is what we always encourage you to do. Go read the primary sources. We've quoted extensively from the trial transcript to you guys, and you get to be the jury. You get to decide, you know, whether you think all of this was brought to light before the jury, whether, you know, who has the better answer. If Jay's answers are believable, you get to judge them because we are reading to you exactly what was said in court. Of course, we're giving, you know, our own explanation of what we think is happening, but a lot of this episode has been straight from the transcript. So before you kind of jump on whether there's any conspiracy theory or whether there's really a tap, tap, tap going on, I say go read the primary sources. And it's hard. It's really long. There's a lot to read, but that's where you get kind of the unshaded, unbiased truth because it's words out of someone's mouth written on transcripts.
And we've linked to it all on the website. We put the police report minus the photographs on the website. You can read the whole police report if you want to. If we get new stuff, we're currently trying to get something right now, which I'm struggling with. If we get new stuff, we're going to put that on as well. You can read it all. You can check it out. Do it. And because, as we've said before, it's great that people think having lawyers talk about this stuff is enlightening. I'm sure it is. But juries are made up of regular people. Regular people with common sense. That's the thing that matters. You have the trial. Read the trial. Apply your common sense to it. And you may come away thinking, wow, the way they interpreted it was completely wrong. And that's fine, but you'll be doing it from a basis of knowledge, not what people have told you, including us. So if this is a case that fascinates you, take the time to do that. I mean, you're spending 14 hours at least with us, more than that, probably more like 20 by the time this is over. You might as well read the transcript, right? You could probably do it in that much time. All right, well, that's all we have for today, but check us out next week. Until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the prosecutors.
The cell phone expert Abe
Waronowitz.
Got it. But instead of resuming with Jay, the cell phone expert Abe Waronowitz.
Close enough. I don't even know if that's how you pronounce it. I mean, you know.
Now I can't say it at all. I can't say it at all now. The cell phone expert Abe Waronowitz testifies, and we'll come back to that in a minute. After
After the cell phone expert.
After the cell phone expert testifies, then Jay is back on the stand.
Kind of breaking up a little bit.
I'm breaking
There's
up?
only a problem for these people. Yeah.
Oh. Okay. Sorry.
It's okay. I'm just
Can
letting
you
know.
hear me
It
okay
wasn't
then?
terrible. I mean, I could hear you, but you may have to move your extender near wherever
Okay.
you are. But it's fine.
Okay.
It's fine. We can hear you.
Okay.
It was just a little. You may have to turn your video off. I don't know.
Maybe you turn your video off.
See what hit blockbusters are streaming free this month during Popcorn Summer Movies on PlutoTV. Watch Django Unchained or Transformers Dark of the Moon for an action-packed evening, or The Truman Show and School of Rock for a good laugh with the whole family. Plus, PlutoTV has thousands of other free movies available on live and on demand.